Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the LiveFitNow Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is another conversation I cannot wait for you to hear. A lovely lady who is a nutritional therapist and also lives with type 1 diabetes, so has so many wonderful things to share with us all. And once again, I just can't wait for you to listen to the conversation. Please do share with your family and friends, especially tag anyone if you know that they live with type 1 diabetes. Perhaps they know someone who has type 1 diabetes. Not only are there so many general things to take away from this, regardless of that link, it really is a wonderful conversation. So I thoroughly recommend you listen right the way through to the end. So without further ado, here is the conversation. My guest today is founder of a nutrition clinic that focuses on a no-nonsense approach to eating well and living well. A registered nutritional therapist and big advocate of intuitive eating, combining the latest evidence-based advice with person-centered care. Having trained in health psychology, she blends the emotional and the physical in her clinic. As a child, she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which has had a strong impact on her life, and we will delve into more today. Welcome to the LiveFitNow Podcast, Beth Edwards. How are you today?
Hi, Vicki. I'm really well, thank you. Oh, that's a really nice introduction. Like, I'm obviously aware of it, but it's sort of nice having somebody read it back to you. Yeah, how lovely.
Oh, you're so welcome. So I would love to start by letting you share your story. How have you reached this point? What's your background, your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to share that. So, I mean, it's been a journey. I think that's probably true of most people's experiences. But so I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 9. So type 1 is an autoimmune condition. So that just means that something goes a little bit haywire with immunity, and unfortunately our own body attacks our body cells. So what happens with type 1 is actually the cells in our pancreas that produce insulin get destroyed. So it's kind of an all or nothing situation. So as soon as you have that autoimmune attack, you then have to go on to insulin immediately. So I was sort of age 9 in a hospital bed, and my consultant, who was really, really lovely, this kind of older, gentle man, and he said, you just have to put this syringe in your leg, and I was kind of like, what? That doesn't make much sense. Like, why would I put that in my leg? So we have this kind of, my family and me had this kind of like huge introduction to life with type 1. And, when I was a child at 9, I think a lot of the care was done by my parents. So I always injected, I always tested my blood sugars, but they were the ones, I think, carrying that kind of emotional load, and also just what food we were eating, how my insulin regime was. So it was kind of just something we all had to get on with. And I think it was only as I entered my teenage years that the impact of this chronic diagnosis really kind of hit. And I became just intuitively very interested in health. And, with type 1, there's such a huge onus on the person to be their own pancreas and to be able to monitor blood sugars, insulin levels. So there's quite a responsibility, and I think as a teenager that just led me into kind of more food and more cooking and more exercise. And I ended up doing a lot of the sort of family cooking. So for meals, I would always be meal planning and prepping and reading Jamie Oliver and kind of getting behind Delia Smith. And I just was very, very interested in cooking, and I loved baking as well. So I think food has always kind of been on the agenda. I've got a hungry belly, so that's something I'm very proud of. And then I kind of ended up working in psychology for quite a few years as well. So I did a degree in psychology, and I was thinking about going perhaps down the clinical route in psychology. So I ended up working in a couple of prisons, which is very interesting, very different to what I do now. And then I was just always sort of aware that in the background of the psychology is this huge health piece as well, and the sort of intersection of how health and things like chronic conditions, and I'm talking about type 1 as well here, this is my personal experience, the intersection of that with the emotional side of things. So I ended up then going into research of in health psychology, which is a fascinating field. And I think it's something that's, I mean, I'm biased, but I think it's growing and I think it's so important. And then I ended up working in food for a couple of years as well. So I was working for some big companies, trying to help them understand how they can better position their products in terms of health aspects and looking at health trends. And really, I was just thinking, I just want to do more of this, and I want to do more of nutrition. I've always been interested, and maybe now is the time that I just bite the bullet and go for it. So I did. I spent 3 years then training in nutritional therapy, and fast forward to today, where I try and nourish my clients and myself with whole foods, simplistic approaches to eating well and living well. I think in nutrition, it feels like it's a complicated thing, and of course it is, but fundamentally, if we're thinking about good food, we can simplify that and we can make it pragmatic and delicious and unrestrictive. This is kind of my cornerstones of my approach. And I specialize in type 1 diabetes because when I was looking for some sort of nutrition support for myself all these years ago, there just wasn't a lot out there. So there's this huge gap, and I think a lot of the clients I see understand their body, understand their health very, very well. And I think on paper, everything looks good. Their blood sugars look good. Their HbA1c, which is an average measure of control, looks good. So in terms of their NHS input from their consultants and their nurses, they're happy. But the clients are sort of feeling like something's missing, or actually living with this type 1 gig is pretty hard and they'd like some support. They might want to fine tune their nutrition. So they come to me and I just give them a little bit more additional support in terms of how you can live with this chronic condition, how you can eat well with it, but also not restrict. And also, how you can kind of incorporate exercise too, because I think that's a huge piece, which is, again, a little bit missing in terms of conventional NHS advice, because exercise for each type 1 is very different, and it's a very different experience. So there we go. That's a lot of information there, but I guess it shows the journey that I have been on to get here.
That was a wonderful summary, and there's a couple of questions that stem from that, but I'm going to start with asking, are there any particular key things when it comes to diet and nutrition that if you do have type 1 diabetes you have to take into consideration, or is it really an across the board thing?
That's a great question. There are definitely some things that we need to pay attention to. So what's wonderful is that the NHS provides these amazing courses for people with type 1. And the course is all about how you count carbohydrates. So that's a very common phrase in the type 1 community, like counting carbs, all of this stuff. Because when we think about carbohydrates, when we eat them, they get broken down into simple sugars in our body. And the sort of fundamental piece of type 1 diabetes is making sure blood sugar balance is nice and stable and nice and in range. So whenever we think about eating carbohydrates, we have to sort of think about matching the insulin need for those carbs. So carb counting is kind of like, shorthand for type 1. Like it's sort of it's in our DNA because we just have to be able to understand. So some people might weigh their carbs. Some people might use some apps. There's a really nice one called Carbs and Bolus, and you can then just see like a sort of plate, and it gives you an idea of how many carbs there might be in there. So I think that's a pretty recognized thing within type 1. But I guess what I would also throw into that mix is that another important piece is actually monitoring how much fat we eat as well. And I am very pro-fat. I am not against fat at all, but we just have to think about how it impacts our blood sugars as well. So fat can have a big impact on how quickly carbohydrates are broken down and released into our bloodstream. So some people, for example, the thing that strikes me is pizza. Like lots of type 1s will find pizza a bit tricky because it's quite a large amount of carbohydrates and then a large amount of fat. So it's thinking, how can we deliver the insulin across a nice period of time? So people will use what's called extended boluses, or they might inject themselves twice. So it's kind of a complicated picture, but I guess it's thinking about carbohydrates, absolutely, but then also thinking about fat intake as well. And additionally, protein, so the other macronutrient. Protein will also have an effect of slowing down release of glucose into the bloodstream. Yes.
That's great. And do you find that, I'm not looking to criticize the NHS at all, but do you think there is a lack of information to understand the whole package? Do you think the focus is very much on the carbohydrate side? Is it changing all the time, or is it a fairly broad information pack that's being given?
I think it's a really good start, actually. I think it's a fantastic start, and it makes a lot of sense. And it is updating all the time as well. So I think they will definitely talk about fat and sort of fat release and how that can impact blood sugars. But I think that the challenge with the NHS is that it can't be individualized completely. So often with these courses, these carb counting courses, you will be in a group of like 5 or 6, or maybe a bit more, bit less. But sometimes it's hard to get the individual sort of in-depth picture when you're doing a group session like that. So I remember when I was doing my carbohydrate counting course, which was fantastic, and I learned so much. You get that peer support, which is great, but we were sort of talking about how to bolus for things like a big jacket potato. And actually at that time, and I'm sure we'll come on to this as well, I was doing more of a low carb approach. So it wasn't always that relevant to me. And I think when I sort of flagged the low carb thing, it wasn't received as well as perhaps I was expecting. So I think there are just tensions around the individual who's got full access to the internet these days, has got perhaps a bit of time to investigate, to go on forums and see. And then the individual then wants to sort of talk to the healthcare professional, and there can be a little bit of a jarring, I think, sometimes. So yeah, I think it's continually evolving, but I think that is the tension, is how can you develop individualized care to a mass audience, which is very difficult.
Yeah, and I guess the conversation so often concluded this, it really is, the onus is on the individual to take action for your own life, because no one knows you better than you. So I guess if you're prepared to be open-minded and find out lots of information, and then you can see what works best for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because type 1 as well, it's a very odd condition, and I can say that because I live with it and I see people day in, day out with this condition. But you know, if things are going well, things are great, but if things are bad, things are really bad. And I think it's so on the individual, because the healthcare provider can't be with you 24/7. So you have to just do a lot behind the scenes, and that's super important. But it also then means that you do know your body best, as you say, Vicki, and that means that you know what you're doing. And I've definitely felt in the past sometimes there may have been a bit of conflict, maybe, when I've sort of introduced these topics, and people don't always like to hear them. But I do think that there is a change, and I think healthcare providers are doing a great job of keeping up with all of the updates. Yeah. So, and I'm sure that will continue in the next months and years to come.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And for people that perhaps have only come into contact with people, or have never been truly close to someone that has it, or perhaps they have but never asked the question, what does type 1 diabetes mean? Like, what impact does it have on your daily life? What does it mean?
I love that question. Thank you for asking that, because people often don't ask it. And I would say, and again, for every type 1, it's different, but for me, it's huge. You know, it impacts everything. I think this is a very common thing in type 1. I think we often just downplay it and kind of say, oh yeah, it's no biggie. Like we just have to inject, and we just have to watch the carbs, but we're fine. But actually, the moment I wake up, the first sort of thing I'm thinking is, what are the blood sugars, and what's my day looking like, and how much stress is there going to be, because that will have an impact. And what day in my monthly cycle am I on, because that has a huge impact. And am I ill? Am I, excited? Is the weather hot? Is the weather cold? It's just everything can impact type 1. And we often sort of say, 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4 with type 1 diabetes, because we try and make it, what's the word? Let me think of a good word. But we try and make it play by the rules, and we think of it as a perfect science, because we can work out carbohydrate ratios and dosages, and we can weigh things out, carbohydrates, etc. But it just doesn't always play like that. It's kind of 80% science, 20% art. It's very, it can be very fickle. And I do think therein lies the challenge of life with type 1, is how do you pick yourself up again after having a day, perhaps the previous day, of high blood sugars for no reason. You're putting in insulin, it feels like water, there's no impact on your blood sugars. How do you then pick yourself up and do it all over again, because you have to?
It's a real challenge, and you can never forget about it.
No, absolutely. There's a really fantastic, I always talk about this man because he had such an impact on my experience and my understanding of my type 1. So his name is Dr. Bill Polonsky, and he is a diabetes psychologist who works in the US. And he's just been doing some amazing work for the last 30 years, trying to broadcast the fact that type 1 is just as much an emotional condition as it is a physical one. And he provides amazing support, not just to people with type 1 and their families, but also to healthcare providers who want to understand more about what this really means. And he said to me once, and I've never forgotten it, but he said, type 1 diabetes is like being given a job that you never applied to do, that you actually have to spend quite a lot of time working hard at, that you get no holiday from, you get no pay to do this. And actually, by the way, you can't leave. And I think that just really summarizes what type 1 is. It's this 24/7 thing that we just have to manage.
Do you find, because your background is so interesting with the psychology part of it, is actually that a big part of how you work with people, as much as the focus maybe around nutrition? So many of our, and this actually applies, I think, across the board, as individuals, we all have our psychological stumbling blocks, things that have happened, traumas, whatever it might be. And it's actually that we need to unravel in order to have that good relationship with each other, with food, with exercise, whatever it might be. So do you think one of your sort of unique selling points is the fact that you really can bring that psychology into it, because there is so much power within our minds? It can give us so much, and it can take so much.
Oh, it totally could do that. Yes. I mean, I'd like to think so. And I think you're right. I think the psychology part is huge. And actually, I feel so fortunate to be able to draw upon that experience when working with clients, because quite often, I mean, I'm sure you see this with your clients too, but there is a sense of not doing a good enough job, or, not being perfect, whatever that actually means. And I really want to just give people a sort of virtual hug in many ways, because actually we don't give enough space to just how hard we're working sometimes. And I think if all I do working in nutrition with people with type 1 is just give them space to reflect on how much work they have to do, then I'm happy with that. If that's all I can do for them, I'm glad, because I just think it's so important. And having sort of beaten myself up for many years in the past, and also, still today a little bit with my own type 1, I know how harsh we can be on ourselves. And you're quite right, if the psychology is not really in place, we're going to really struggle to be able to implement anything that's going to support us in terms of exercising for the right reason. I don't want people to feel they have to exercise because they want to lose weight, or they want to control their blood sugars better. Like that, those are all sort of reasons, but we also want the other reason to be that actually it makes you feel good, and it's a hobby and it's enjoyable. I don't want it to be a sort of rod you beat your back with. And the same with food. I think people will come to me, and the interesting thing about type 1 is that we have such a unique relationship with food, because it's very hard to completely separate yourself from what you eat, because whenever you eat anything, that will impact blood sugars. And I think very subtly and quite cleverly, our brains can sometimes go, well, actually, hang on, that piece of fruit spiked my blood sugars. That fruit is not to be trusted. That fruit is not safe. I'm not eating that. And this can happen very, very cleverly in the background, and we don't always realize it. And then we start, I'll start working with somebody, and of course we're thinking about nutrition and food, and we'll touch on some of the relationship to food pieces, and I'll realize that perhaps somebody, without knowing, is unconsciously restricting their food intake for all the right reasons, because the brain has said, hey, this isn't what we want to be doing for our blood sugars. So it's all for good reason, but ultimately in the long run doesn't serve us. So it's thinking, how can we unpick that and improve that relationship to food and that relationship to eating everything, because you can eat everything with type 1 diabetes, contrary to what lots of people say online.
The internet's both wonderful and a nightmare.
Absolutely.
So I hope you feel like this is within your remit. I don't want to push you somewhere that you don't want to go, but again, I think perhaps there's a lack of understanding between type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes, because they are very, very different things, and how they can be dealt with, I believe, are very different, and you can get very different results. Whereas obviously type 1 is chronic, type 2 doesn't necessarily have to be. Could you potentially just give a broad overview on what the differences are so people can understand?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, unfortunately, with the different types of diabetes, because they come under the same name, there can then be a lot of confusion. And I sort of fall into the camp of thinking we should actually rename the whole order, because, and also just to add to this as an extra bit of information, for a long time we just thought it was gestational diabetes, which is what can come on during pregnancy and usually goes away at the end of pregnancy, but can make you more susceptible to developing type 2 later. So that's gestational. Then there's type 1, which is the autoimmune chronic piece. We used to think that came on in childhood only, but now there's a much more of a move around adult onset type 1. So it's not just something you get in childhood. And then type 2, which is obviously what most people with diabetes, the numbers of diabetes populations in the world, most people will have type 2. That is something that comes on much more slowly and is implicated more in lifestyle factors and genetics as well. So we used to think it was just those three, but actually there's a whole myriad of different types, and things like type 3 diabetes, which is, people are sort of saying could be Alzheimer's, thinking about MODY, which again is a different type, LADA. There's a lot of different types, and I think we're just still trying to unpick what could be going on here.
The waters are getting muddier rather than clearer.
They absolutely are, which again, it's very exciting to see, diabetes get a bit more airtime, but at the same time, it's like, oh gosh, this is much more complicated than we ever understood before. But to sort of simplify, to go back to type 1 and type 2. So type 1, as I sort of mentioned, it's kind of all or nothing. So it's and it's triggered by an autoimmune response. So we don't actually know exactly what that autoimmune response trigger is. We suspect it could be a viral situation. So things like Epstein-Barr virus has been linked to type 1 diabetes onset. Also things around vitamin D. So maternal vitamin D deprivation during pregnancy has then been implicated in the child and their development of type 1, which is interesting. But again, we're not entirely sure. That's a bit muddy. But when we think about type 2, this is where the pancreas is working well and it's producing insulin. But what happens is the cells become resistant to insulin. So this happens over time, and it means that your body has to work harder and you actually need more insulin to have the same effect. So you'll be having higher blood sugars and your body responds by getting the pancreas to pump out more insulin and work a bit harder. But that can then set you off on a bit of a blood sugar roller coaster, where you then might have a bit of a low. So the body goes, oh, you need to eat some food. So you do, then it might spike you again. And it ends up being this undulating picture. But we know that with type 2 development, a lot of it can be genetic. So I think what I really try and get away from is, I think, the media perspective that seems to push this picture of someone who develops type 2 as kind of bringing it on themselves. I fundamentally disagree with that because, illness is not brought on by people in that way, I don't believe. But they will imply that the picture is somebody who may be overweight, somebody whose diet doesn't look particularly healthy, someone who perhaps is more sedentary. And that may be the case for some people. If it is, we should support them, we shouldn't blame them. But also lots of people with quote unquote a very healthy lifestyle can also develop type 2, and that's just down to hereditary genetics. So that's a bit of me going off on a tangent about type 2, but there are ways that you can then, if you sort of catch it early enough in sort of the pre-diabetes stage, there have been clinical trials that have shown you can actually stop and you can reverse type 2. So a couple of those have been around low calorie diets, a couple have been around low carbohydrate diets. There's a sort of growing body of research that's now looking at low fat approaches too. So there's a couple of guys in the US, their umbrella is Mastering Diabetes, and they actually work with type 1 and type 2. And they advocate for a high carbohydrate plant-based approach and a very low fat diet. And that seems to work for some people as well. So that's an exciting piece of research that's growing. But I think within diabetes, there seems to be these kind of polarizing camps. You're either kind of a low carber, and it's low carb or nothing. Carbs are the devil. Or it's a high carb, low fat approach, and it's that way. It's kind of no animal products, no eggs, no dairy, and that's their approach. And I don't want to knock any of these approaches if they work for people. In my experience with my background in psychology, what can happen is that you set people up to fail because they're very extreme, and being able to stick to them is quite a toll. And it can complicate things in terms of food relationships and going out for a meal and all of these things. So I don't advocate those particularly in my clinic unless it's working incredibly well for someone. But generally, by and large, I think there needs to be a balance, 100%.
And it's so interesting because I did know of the low carb concept, but actually I didn't realize that split is actually across society now. I think there's a lot of people that either has one foot in at least one of those camps. So actually it's kind of a similar concept across the board, that people have their idea of which one works best and sort of roll with it. But there's no clear proof then that anything works across the board. Again, it's individual. You've got to figure out what works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add into that as well, I think with the low carb approach, and as you say, it does sort of cross society. And I think that's for a weight loss approach. I see a lot of people that want to lose weight, they go down the low carb route. But there isn't much evidence. Well, in fact, there's no evidence actually for low carb across a long sustained period of time. So the research trials have been looking at epilepsy in children. So the only evidence where low carb approach, or the keto approach, works is in epilepsy in children. And that's been a controlled clinical trial. But in terms of diabetes or weight loss, there really isn't much evidence to say that this is a good idea. And particularly thinking about longitudinal data, we just don't have it. So we don't know that if you go on a low carb diet for 5 years, we have no idea what that means in terms of future health and what the body is going to be doing. So I'm just a bit cautious, I would say, about some of these approaches. And if I think about kind of the food that my grandma used to eat, or she would make, I struggle to think that she would accept a plate of food that had a whole food group restricted. I just, to me, it doesn't make any sense, and it didn't make any sense to her either. And I'm a huge fan of balance, and it's not cool and it's not sexy, but hey, it works. And it also means we haven't got to get something off our plate. I think, of course, we need to be careful about what we eat, and I would say we need to be a bit choosy about types of fat we eat and the quantity, and choosy about types of carbohydrates we eat as well. But I think a blanket ban of a whole food group doesn't make any sense to me. I'm just going to put my cards on the table, and if anybody is following me online, they will know that I stand by this. So I can say it to you. I just, yeah, it doesn't make much sense.
It doesn't. You're right. It's not sexy. It's not, not exciting. And most things do seem to conclude in generally quite dull things. But I think so often when it comes to food is there isn't a magical way that everyone should live their lives. But ultimately, we need to focus on quality and quantity. Like, we just have access to so much food, and so much food that we are naturally drawn towards that we would never have had access to in those quantities.
Yes.
And that is why I think these routes have become so commonplace of, oh, well, if we remove this, this and this, that will be fine because that wasn't there. But actually, any of it's fine if we're not having only that or too much of it.
Oh, completely. No, I completely agree. Like, absolutely. And I think I was talking to my parents on the phone this morning, and we were talking about food. And if you think about seasonality, you know, we're so out of touch. And again, this isn't me blaming anybody, perhaps blaming the food industry slightly, but I just don't think we necessarily need access to every type of fruit or vegetable across the year. Yeah, and even things in terms of fishing. And again, fishing is a tricky subject too, but fish is seasonal. So, you know, fish that comes into certain waters is dependent on temperature and how they migrate. And I don't think we kind of realize that actually we should be eating fish seasonally, same as our produce. And I think something that I sort of impart with my clients is thinking about, let's just have 3 meals a day, and let's make them rich and full plates. Let's not skimp on the meals. Like, let's have a meal and let's make sure you're full at the end. And if you would like something sweet, you know, a little bit of dark chocolate or a pudding or something, have it at the end of your meal, because at that point you will have had all the other food in your body. So in terms of absorption of sugar, that's going to be slower. And I would rather you had that at the end of your meal than you had it perhaps say at 3 p.m. when you're exhausted and you're maybe relying on something to perk you up. That perhaps sugary thing is going to hit your bloodstream really quickly, and it's going to be hard to manage. Whereas if we actually just get a bit cleverer about how and when we eat, it can have huge, dramatically good improvements. And something else I really think there's a big movement around intermittent fasting, and I'll touch on this slightly because, again, the research is patchy at best. But anecdotally, a lot of my clients will use intermittent fasting because it has good impacts on their blood sugars. So quite apart from weight management or anything else, if you're thinking about type 1, people do seem to have some benefit. This isn't me advocating it, but it's just what they're seeing. Yeah. And it's also because I think, you know, if we sort of have nice large gaps in between our meals, it gives our digestive system time just to recuperate and do all of that general maintenance work that it can't do if we're constantly topping up with food. And also thinking about blood sugar balancing. If we're sort of always eating, we're continually spiking a little bit the blood sugar, which requires insulin, which then complicates the picture. So again, it's sort of going back to what my grandma would have done, which would have been 3 meals, hopefully home cooked, but if not, sensible choices, and then maybe something sweet if you fancy it. And it's sort of like, yeah, that works for me and that works for my clients. And as you said, and as I've said as well, definitely not sexy, but it does work.
And sometimes it's things you don't realize. You'll try something like intermittent fasting, and I find the whole circadian rhythm research fascinating, and I think that's why so many people fall into it once they've given it a go, and they're like, oh, it just kind of slots into my life because actually I feel better, I often sleep better, and it just works.
Yeah.
But not necessarily for any particular strict reasons. You say weight loss may be the reason it's drawn you in, but actually then you start to realize how it makes you feel. And if you feel better, that's when you want to start implementing these things into every day, not just for, oh, I do this for a couple of weeks to see if I can lose 5 pounds or whatever else. It's not about that. It's actually about how it makes you feel.
Yes, absolutely. That's so right, because these things have such an impact on mood, on concentration, and it's a kind of holistic look at how it makes your body feel, and it's getting you much more in tune with how your body is feeling. Because on that note as well, and this is the magic of working one-to-one, but having me just said a minute ago, oh, it's 3 meals a day. If you don't want to eat breakfast, and lots of my clients really struggle with breakfast, and they've been told, oh, I've got to have breakfast, break that fast, all of these things. And they're kind of, forcing it in, a big bowl of porridge or something, and they're not feeling good on it. I've just said to them, maybe don't have it, maybe just don't have it. And it means they're having a bit of an extra fast anyway, because let's not forget, you're fasting overnight anyway. So we're talking about intermittent fasting, but everyone's fasting usually, at least for kind of 8 hours anyway. Yeah. If you want to extend that a little bit because it works better for your lifestyle and you feel better eating at 11, great. If you have more mental clarity and you don't, you just don't feel hungry, that's fine. It's whatever sort of works for you. There are no hard and fast rules, and I think that can be a huge benefit, but also a huge complication. Yeah. And I remember when I started studying nutrition, I had this naive belief that I was going to know everything, and I was going to know the answers. Nutritional science is grey at best, and because it's a relatively new discipline as well, if we compare it to sort of some of the hard sciences that have been around for centuries, we've got minuscule amount of time on them, and there just hasn't been the research previously, so there's still so much to learn and to gain. And it's often the way in nutrition, we sort of joke about it and we'll say, oh yeah, one thing one day, one thing another, and quite often that's the case, and we just have to sort of be as pragmatic as possible and continue to look at the evolving evidence base and go with that fits in with the individual's lifestyle. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it can get overwhelming, I think, because there are so many so-called answers out there, and all those answers might have been right for somebody, and sometimes it can just get a little bit overwhelming. Like, it's really interesting you brought up the seasonal thing, because I think it's so interesting how unseasonally so many people eat now. Like, some people would never touch the things from a season, they just eat what they eat all year. I don't know if you've heard, it's just on my bookshelf, a man called Dallas Hartwig, and he's written a book on the 4 seasons solution, essentially changing our lifestyle and our food and our nutrition based on what season we're in and how big an impact it can have on us. So there's so many different types of research and theories out there, and it's impossible to do them all because there is so much.
Yeah.
But if you find out about a few of them and then see what works for you, it can be so empowering, and you can get the best from your life that you can get at that time. I think that's really, really powerful.
Yeah, that book sounds amazing. I'm gonna have to go have a look and see. Yes, please do. Yeah, I'd love to see that.
So a question that came up that I wanted to ask from a little bit earlier is, obviously type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease like I've got myself, but do you find that there are a lot of other conditions that can be, not necessarily complications, but that come hand in hand with it? Are there other autoimmune or other just diseases that you often have to cope with, or people that you've worked with have?
Yeah, absolutely. So we sort of know, and I'm sure you know this too, but with autoimmunity, it does tend to cluster. So it's kind of in for a penny, in for a pound, because you might end up with multiple. There is a high concordance with type 1 diabetes and celiac disease. So that is when you can't process gluten, which is protein. So quite often, I think it's standard course now. It wasn't when I was diagnosed all those years ago, but I think now they automatically test for celiac disease if you get diagnosed with type 1, because it's very common they come together. But also, and I'm not sure of the stats on this, but just anecdotally from my work and what I know in the community, quite often thyroid conditions can come or do come with type 1 as well. So either Hashimoto's, which is when you have low thyroid function, or Graves' disease, which is when you have too much of a thyroid function, and other sort of female hormone conditions. So endometriosis can often come with type 1 as well. So Yeah, and again, I think that's part of the reason I studied nutritional therapy, is that the sort of core belief in nutritional therapy is that we should think about the body as a whole, and there's no point thinking of it in silos, because it doesn't work like that. So I've been trained in that way of thinking, and it's a great way to look at it. Actually, it does make it complicated in some ways, but it means I can get a good overview of what's interconnected and what's interlinking. So if I work in, because I work in type 1 diabetes, that means I also work in autoimmunity, because you have an idea of what that means as well. In terms of autoimmunity, some of the pathways are similar. So it's useful to know that, in terms of maybe another condition someone has, but also in terms of perhaps trying to prevent any further autoimmunity that may crop up down the line. So yes, it is interesting when you talk to people with autoimmunity, because it might not just be one thing. So it's a bit of a tough draw, really, to have to deal with multiple.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And do you have any advice for people? I feel like we're going to go down, it's probably the individual answer, but if you have people around you that do have type 1 diabetes, what can we do to help? Are there things that, is addressing it a good idea? Do people just want to be able to carry on and not feel like they've got this thing that creates an elephant in the room? Like, are there general stereotypes that we can advise people to how to deal with it?
Great question. Yes, I would say the person will lead it, I think. So I'm a very chatty type 1, and I, show my pump off, and people stare at it all the time, and I will often address that and say, oh, you're looking at my insulin pump, let's talk about it. So I'm very happy to bring things up. If you know someone and they live with type 1 and they're very quiet about it, I would say just maybe every now and again you could just touch base and say, like, yeah, how is it going with the type 1? Because I know it's quite a lot. And if they just don't want to go there, then you've got your answer. But it might give them space just to kind of reflect and open up, and maybe say, actually, yeah, having a bit of a rough day. I think the challenge with type 1 is that if I think about my own experience, I don't want kind of sympathy every day, because that will be too much. But I do want to tell people now and again, like, hey, I'm living with this big thing here, this job I can't leave and I don't get paid to do, and I've got my holiday from. So maybe some flowers would be nice. So it's kind of like, if you broke your arm, somebody might send you some flowers, and that's lovely, but that, of course, is acute. When we're thinking about a chronic condition, it's a balance between how much as the individual you want to sort of receive input from other people, or an acknowledgement that they know it's a challenge, versus at the same time, you just have to get on with type 1 as well. So you don't want too much. But I would say, when it comes to food as well, something that I find greatly beneficial is, if I'm going to, like, my in-laws' house, for example, they will always make a kind of buffet style dinner. So they'll make a meal, but they'll just leave the bowls out and you can serve yourself. And I have found that so wonderful, because no one's making a big deal over the fact that maybe I don't want to have as much rice as everybody else, or maybe I want to have a little bit less of this or more of that. Nobody notices. No one's saying, hey, Beth, let's talk about your type 1 and what food are you going to eat now. No one does that, thank goodness. But it means I can also not have to compromise my health and my health goals. So I would say things like that. And within my friendship group, people will talk about kind of Beth friendly foods, which is kind of less relevant now, just because I think I found a place with food where I'm very comfortable eating a range of things. But when I mentioned I'd previously done low carb, and people would say, oh, is that Beth friendly? And it just it was kind of a nice way of just making it a bit lighthearted and not so serious. That worked for me. But I think, again, I'm sort of loath to say it's the individual approach again, but it's sort of, I think that's probably the way it goes.
Of course.
And also, if you are supporting someone with type 1, or you know someone with type 1, maybe just check out some blogs, have a look online, maybe just have a little bit of education around what this thing is, so that maybe it never comes up in conversation, but at least if it does, you sort of know, actually this person's going through quite a lot, and I might be able to sort of inject some support in a way. Because I think it's quite a complicated condition, and sometimes that makes people, quite rightly, shy away from asking questions. I understand that completely. So maybe having a bit more information around what it is and what it involves, or some lived experiences from people who are more willing to, put it online and things, that might be helpful.
That couldn't more perfectly lead on to the next question that I was going to ask you, and that is there a good support network out there?
Yes, there's a hugely, an amazing support network. And I can't speak about other conditions really, but in terms of diabetes, the diabetes online community is just this incredible, dynamic, supportive beast, really. It's just incredible. And you sort of, if you want it, you get this lifetime pass into it. And there are certain hashtags you can use. If you just use hashtag DOC on Instagram, you will just see loads of posts, loads of support. There are some amazing podcasts out there. So Jen Greaves does an amazing podcast. There's Bolus Maxim is another great podcast from the US. There are so many great blogs. And the great thing about it is, if you want to go on and talk to somebody and just say, do you know what, I'm having a rubbish day with type 1, you know the other person's going to completely understand what that means, what a hypo feels like, what a day of high blood sugars feel like. And so it's just a real comfort. And if someone is looking for support, I would hugely encourage them to seek out this community, because it's a bit of a lifeline, really.
Oh, that's fantastic to hear. It's so nice that the internet can bring such wonderful connection to people all over the world.
Yeah.
And are there any common myths, and this can be linked to type 1 diabetes specifically, or even just nutrition, or anything you like really, are there any particular myths you would like to debunk?
Oh, where can I start? I think, well, if I think about type 1, and I'm thinking about lots of things that always come up, people may say to someone with type 1, oh, did you get it because you ate too much sugar? And this is one that comes up quite a lot, and I think a lot of us with type 1 have probably been asked this at least once. The answer is no. It's nothing to do with sugar intake. It's nothing to do with any dietary input, really. It just is an autoimmune attack, unfortunately. But I would also say the same about type 2. As I was saying earlier, it's not just because of what you may have eaten that's going to cause this condition. It's much more complicated and nuanced than that. So I think it's a myth I want to debunk for both type 1 and type 2. And also, I then think the other big thing is, can you eat that? That's another question that we often get asked. And it's coming from a nice place. People sort of saying, okay, you sure you can eat that? I thought you couldn't eat that. And to be fair, I get it, because, some days I might be wanting to avoid sugar, and some days I need sugar to keep me alive. So I get it's confusing for people. But it's not always that helpful when you sort of hear those kind of questions, because the individual will be in charge of their condition and they will know what they're eating. So yeah, people can eat whatever they like, really, with type 1, unless they found a way of eating that works for them and they've chosen not to eat certain thing, fine. But by and large, you can eat whatever you like. Yeah.
You've already calculated it in your head. You don't need someone to point it out to you.
Exactly. You're probably already pre-bolused for it, and you're probably happily on your way to sort of working out all the mathematics and all of that. And I think just probably in nutrition generally, and I think it's my approach really, but you do end up seeing quite dogmatic approaches to certain ways of eating or certain lifestyles, and it's much more nuanced. if something works for an individual person, that's fine. But I think we have to be careful if we advise to the masses, it's this way or nothing, because it often isn't, and it doesn't need to be one way. So I think, I'm thinking kind of low carb approaches, I'm thinking of veganism, I'm thinking of the opposite end of sort of no fat but high carb. Again, these are all approaches, but I don't think it necessarily needs to be this or nothing. And I often think about a couple of my lecturers in nutritional therapy. Some of them were very much into sort of the paleo approach of eating, and some of them very much into a more vegan approach, or plant-based vegan approach. And that just highlighted to me just how complicated and also amazing it is that these different approaches can work for different people. And it was quite a reassuring thing that they weren't all following the same approach, because it was the answer. It just shows that for any given individual, one thing may work and another thing may not. And that's my advice, I think, going out like to the listeners. It's just, you haven't got to feel like you need to follow a certain way, because it often isn't that simple, sadly.
No, and do you think, this has come up in conversation before, that we can very much become intertwined with our diet, can become our identity, and actually sometimes what might work for us, for example, in our 20s, by the time we're in our 40s, may need to be different, but we've clung on to what we did then, and we have to stay with that. Whereas actually, perhaps if we have a slightly more flexible and adaptive evolutionary approach, we can just allow our bodies to tell us what it wants and needs as we grow.
Yes, how amazing is that? That's such a lovely approach. I love that idea of a kind of evolutionary perspective, because you're so right that at different life stages we have different requirements. So if you look at a female who is menstruating, she will need higher amounts of iron because you're losing a lot of that iron every month. Whereas when you get to menopause, you may not need as much in your diet because you're not bleeding every month. So that's quite a sort of logical thing to think, but there are so many more examples like that as well. And I think you're quite right, because when I was sort of doing, and this is years and years ago now, before I studied anything in nutrition, but when I was doing low carb, I sort of felt like I'd hung my hat on that, and like all my friends and my family knew that I was not eating carbs, and Beth couldn't eat that. And then actually I decided it wasn't working for me, and I was really miserable and I was really hungry. I then had to sort of say, actually, I don't do that anymore. And I did feel a little bit of an identity crisis in a way, because I had to admit that actually that didn't work. And I'm just going to eat normally now. but it was, it was kind of like I did feel perhaps a bit of shame there that I had to sort of change tack. But I like your approach of thinking that instead, we do have different needs and different requirements as we live, and also as our lifestyle changes. One particular point we might be very active and doing some high intensity weight training, and at another time we may have eased off that, doing perhaps yin yoga, which requires different types of input, nutrients and food. So I think it's a sensible way to look at it, and also quite a reassuring one that, of course, as we grow and as we develop and change, there'll be different requirements of us.
Yeah, I think it's about reawakening our connection with ourselves. I think there's so many ideas of things we're meant to do and be, whereas actually our body is incredibly, it's just amazing. Like what our bodies can do is incredible, and it can tell us so much, and we can choose to ignore it completely, or we can slowly awaken that connection and actually allow our bodies to tell us a lot of the time what we need to do, whether that be rest more, eat more, drink more. Like there's so many different ways it tells us how it's feeling. It's just whether we're paying attention to it or not.
Oh, you're so right. You're so right. And I mean, even as I'm listening to that, I'm sort of thinking that there's always a bit more work to be done, because and I think lots of people, I'm sure, feel the same, but the resting piece just jumped out immediately. My body will tell me, and it does it quite well, does it quite loudly. But if I've set my week up and I'm like, no, I'm getting up at 7 and I'm doing this run, or I'm doing this, I'm doing it. And actually my body's saying, no, you really want to just have an extra half hour. And I think that, yeah, a little bit more listening and slowing is so beneficial. But it does take a conscious, intentional practice to be able to get there. And I totally agree with you that hopefully we are collectively moving towards that. And I sort of see that in the community, and I see people who've, previously posted things online about running at 6 a.m. actually having a morning bath at 9 a.m. and I'm here for that. I'm 100% here for that. So it's nice to see, hopefully we are moving towards more of a restful, intuitive way of living.
It just takes time, doesn't it? Because again, it comes back to psychology too. There are things that lead us to do this, then that, then the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
We have to rewrite those pathways so that we're not falling into habits that just happen because they always have. We don't actually need to let that happen. We can rewrite those pathways.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and the world won't end if we rewrite those pathways. That's the thing. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what lockdown taught us right in the beginning. It feels like a million years ago now, but I remember this kind of collective joyous moment where everyone was like, oh, my calendar is clear, like for you. And I really hope we can take a few of those sentiments forward as, whatever's coming for us next, whatever that might look like, whether it's more lockdown, which I think it will be, or perhaps an easing off in some areas. I really hope we can bring a little bit of this slow and steady, slow living with us, because what a gift that has been.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. There's definitely lots of positives to come from this very challenging time.
Yeah.
So this is a question I like to ask everybody, and you can apply it to your job and your business or to life as a whole, but what inspires you?
Oh, such a good question. What inspires me? Oh, well, I think because I know that I have so much to do with my health, and I have so much in the kind of mechanics of just getting up and doing stuff and living, I think quite often I will mirror other people with type 1, or I'll see what they're doing. And there are some really, really good blogs and sort of day in the life videos and things like that. And I just find that so inspirational that actually someone else, I mean, of course I know this logically, that someone else who lives with type 1 is also getting up and doing the same mechanics as me. It's just so nice, so inspirational, and so comforting to watch someone else do it. And it just makes me feel part of a group and a tribe, and sort of, I'm not doing it alone. And I think that's a huge source of inspiration for me. And there are a couple of people in nutrition as well who are kind of changing the shape of nutrition and are bringing much more of a sort of slow living approach to nutrition. I'm thinking of Nicola Moore. She's my mentor actually, and she's just fabulous, and she's trying to spread positive food messages. And if I'm ever having a sort of down day thinking in nutrition, it's just the research is all over the place, what are we doing? I sort of think about her and a few of her contemporaries who actually fundamentally are there to plow through all of that anyway. And they've been in the industry for sort of 10, 15 years, and they've seen it all, but they're still showing up for their clients and trying to make nutrition and healthy living accessible to lots of people. And that is just so inspirational. And Nicola's got a really good podcast as well, so I think it's called Healthfully. So yeah, for any other listeners who want another podcast recommendation, that's a good one.
Connection, isn't it? Connection is so important. We really do need that. I'd quite like to ask actually, obviously nutrition is at your core, but what do you put up there as your most important things to include in your life to feel healthy and well, with good well-being?
Oh, that's so lovely. Yeah, connection, as you say, is so, so huge. And I think at the end of the day, all we want out of life is to be heard and to be understood and to be seen as who we actually are. That's the other thing. I think so often we're all wearing masks, and we're trying to sort of do these things because we think maybe we're meant to do these things. And actually, stripping that all back and revealing who we truly are and being seen for that person, what a joy that is. And I think that for me comes in my female friendships. So, you know, I've got some very good female friends, and I'm so grateful for them. And we might sort of do a WhatsApp every day, and it might just be talking rubbish, or, you know, just how are you, all good. But that's so powerful that I know they're there, and if I need them, they're there as well. So I think you're right, connection and conversation is just so important. This is why this is a lovely conversation to have as well with you, because it's what comes out of the conversation, the connection is a shared understanding, and a knowledge share, and inspirational bits come from things too. So I would say, yeah, that's sort of fundamental to being a human for me. But also, and I feel a bit trendy saying this, but being in nature is just huge. Yes, woohoo! You know, I grew up in Shropshire, so Shropshire is the only county, or one of the only counties, not to have a city. So I was living in a new town, but we had fields on our doorstep, and you know, you just grow up with it, right? And you don't understand that this isn't how it is in all the different parts of the country. I'm now in London, and I'm very fortunate to be close to nice commons, but there's nothing quite like being in a wood or being in trees and breathing it in. And there's so much research coming out now saying that actually trees can make you feel really good, in a sort of more biological, physiological sense, not just a psychological one. So I think being in nature is something I really have to prioritize, even if it's just taking off my shoes and walking on the grass, because that grounding is something that we just don't, I hadn't prioritized before.
It's magic, isn't it? But you don't necessarily, particularly when you're a kid, you just sort of bound around and you don't even think about it. It's not until you're older and you start to just catch yourself in moments and realize how it makes you feel.
Yes, completely. And I think there's something, if I'm thinking about walking, and again, as a kid, I mean, I'd never thought I'd come on a podcast in my 30s and say I'm a big fan of walking, but here we are. I've always loved walking. It's just, it's me time. I can put on a podcast, I can put on nothing, I can sit and I can walk and I can think. But that repetitive motion of like one foot in front of the other has such a comforting air to it. And I turn my phone off, and you know, you can just not have to do anything apart from just walk from A to B. And you know, I'm increasingly aware of how incredible it is to make space to do that.
And the science around it all is just fascinating as well. And even if you're if you need a difficult conversation to have with a partner or a friend, they say actually it's walking side by side and doing it walking allows for conversation, whereas sat opposite each other on a table can be really confrontational and can stop a good conversation being had, whereas actually they're proving that walking side by side creates a greater connection. I mean, it's so fascinating. And I share all the sentiments that you just and it is wonderful that something so simple can make us feel so much better.
Yes, absolutely. And isn't it wonderful to know that we have it in our toolkit, you know? So all you need, and again, this isn't possible for everybody, but it's a pair of shoes and a bit of space and some time. And I think if we're thinking about fitness, there we go. Like, it's right there. We haven't got to do lots of other things if we don't want to. We've just got this accessible to us, and that's wonderful to know that.
It absolutely is. Anyone can do it at any time.
Yeah.
So I would like to finish off by giving you the floor to share one thing that you think everyone would benefit from knowing.
Oh, say again, sorry. I lost
one thing that you think everyone would benefit from knowing.
Oh, I think everybody needs to understand just how much they're capable of. So this is very, very woo-woo, and I'm aware of that, but I'm growing much more towards this. But I'm thinking about people with type 1, but also other people. And if you think about just the resilience people have, getting up, doing life in lockdown, doing life, home working with children, with looking after relatives. There's so much, and we just do it. And I would love people to really sit and to really know just how much power there is in their resilience, because it's phenomenal. And us psychologically as human beings have so much resilience, and I don't think we talk about it that much. And I would really like people to know their own resilience and their own power.
Brilliant. I absolutely love that sentiment. I couldn't agree with you more. It's so good. And so what does the future hold for you? What is the future of your nutrition clinic?
Oh yes, well, it's super exciting. So I'm just about to launch a special package coming next week. So that's Reset and Rebalance, and that is 3 months of intensive one-to-one work with me, with a handful of people who live with type 1. So there's that side, and all the type 1 stuff is so exciting, and that's where the clinic is growing. But I also want to be able to support people who might require some help with their relationship to food. So this can be for anybody, not just somebody with type 1. But I just see this huge need as well. Like, I've worked with clients, and I'm thinking of sort of busy mums mostly, who may not have anything, quote unquote, diagnosed and wrong, as it were, but have just lost their way with food because life gets busy. And perhaps they've read something about, carbohydrates or fat, and they just, it's not working for them. And from my psychology background, I would just love to be able to offer something to that group of people, where actually finding your groove with food again and doing it in sensible, realistic ways, not having to require lots of effort and time and energy, but just trying to get some of those foundational pieces in place is so important. So Beth Edwards Nutrition is in 2 parts. So there's the type 1 part, and there's this kind of food relationship part as well. And I'm excited about growing that next year. So that's sort of coming 2021. And I might be doing a podcast, I might not. It's all kind of, yes, very exciting. It's kind of been on the back burner, but this is a very inspirational conversation talking to you, thinking how nice it is to do something like this. So lots of ideas. It's just, I've got to not get ahead of myself, I think.
That's the thing, isn't it? There's so many exciting possibilities. It's just choosing what to focus on first.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So where is the best place for my audience to find you on the internet? And I will pop it all in my show notes.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Well, I'm mostly on Instagram. You'll probably see me doing a story or something, or probably doing a reel, which I've got into, and I can feel myself getting addicted to the reels now. So I am at Beth Edwards Nutrition there. That's all my type 1 diabetes stuff. I'm also at the Spoonful Collective, which is the relationship to food pieces. My website is bethedwardsnutrition.com, and I think those are probably the most reliable places to get me. So yeah, but do come and say hi. I'm often chatting in the direct messages, so it's always nice to see new people. If anybody wants to say hello.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I have absolutely loved this conversation. I was looking forward to it, but it was even better than I had hoped. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been wonderful to make a new connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been so nice talking to you, and this whole conversation has just felt so comforting and soothing, and I so appreciate you giving airtime to type 1 diabetes, because clearly I'm passionate and biased, but it's so nice that you have an interest and you've given me space to talk about these things. So thank you for having me on. What a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to episode 28 of the LiveFitNow podcast. I am so happy that you have listened to this very wonderful conversation with Beth. I so hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I felt like I learned a lot. She shared so much, not only about her own story, but the story of what it can be like living with type 1 diabetes, and so many wonderful nuggets of information that can actually help all of us in living a longer, healthier, happier life. So thanks again for listening. Please do remember, it's so helpful to spread the message of this podcast by sharing with your family and friends, whether it be through word of mouth, sharing on social media, or indeed tagging your friends and family. Thanks again for listening to this episode. Until next Thursday.